Have you ever purchased something and immediately regretted it? Okay, think about that for a second. Think about the thing that maybe you bought and then you regretted it. A few years ago, well, actually quite a few years ago, Lori and I were married, and then we had a baby on the way, and then we had number 2 coming up, and we decided it was time to change our vehicle to move on from my amazingly awesome Honda Prelude. That was the car right there. That's why she married me, was for my car. Yeah. No, she didn't. That's a good thing, because if somebody marries you for your car, there's a problem already in the marriage. So, no, we decided it was time to get a different car. So we went car shopping, and we found a car that we kind of liked. She liked the color purple. There was kind of this. It wasn't a purple, but it had a hint of purple to it. We found a Ford Taurus, and they were pretty popular cars. And we're like, hey, that's a little bit more family friendly than this 2-door Honda Prelude. So we bought the car. We traded in my car. We got this car, and Lori the next day took off, went up to her parents' house, and on the way back, everything was fine. Got back to the house, and she goes, it drives great, but boy, there's something in it. It doesn't smell right. There's something going on. It was a used car, and so I took it back over to the dealership and talked to them a little bit. I'm like, hey, here's the deal. We can't get rid of the smell. There's nothing we can do about it. It's going to be in this vehicle forever, apparently. We'd like our money back. And that sounds weird to do, but in Arizona at the time, they had a lemon law, and if you had a problem with a vehicle that you bought, you had a certain amount of days. I think you had like 10 days to bring it back, or 30 days, something like that. So we took it back, and they gave us our money back, and we went to a different dealership after that because we felt weird going back to them after telling them we didn't like it. But if you've ever been in a similar situation, you have experienced what's called buyer's remorse. You buy something, and then you're like, oh, why'd we spend money on that? Or this isn't what I thought it was going to be, and you kind of get bummed out about it. Well, taking that idea, we've got to understand, as we're getting into 1 Peter, as we've been going through this, the people that Peter is writing to, these people, they are dealing with buyer's remorse in their faith. They have made this commitment to follow Jesus, and things aren't going great. In their culture, when they committed to following a God and they started serving a God and they did these offerings to a God, the God would bless them by making their lives better, give them more stuff, take care of them, and whenever life started getting a little crazy, that meant that God was mad at them, that they weren't doing enough. And so now they've made this commitment to follow Jesus, and they're dealing with a little bit of buyer's remorse because they are being rejected. And for those of you who maybe just trying to catch up with us, Peter is writing to a group of people who have been scattered. They have been sent all over the place simply because they believe in Jesus. They have had to abandon their families, their friends, where they've grown up. It would be like if you've grown up in Dumas and all of a sudden Dumas became anti-Christian and you started getting persecuted for being a Christian. And the only way that you could survive, the only way you could provide for your family is to go to another place, because no one would buy or sell anything with you. No one would take care of you. No one would help you. You were getting rejected. You weren't having any friends. And so you go. And so these people were scattered everywhere. Here's the thing. They knew, they kind of understood that they had a new identity with Jesus. But they didn't fully understand what it was going to cost them. And so Peter has taken some time to help them understand the cost that it cost them to step into this new identity. It cost Jesus his life. Their new identity wasn't necessarily free. It cost them. It cost them Jesus' life. They didn't realize that their suffering that they were going to go through might be a picture of something bigger. They didn't realize that the suffering that they were going through had a deeper spiritual meaning for them, maybe even in the future. And so Peter is trying to open up this idea that you accept Jesus and everything is going to be perfect. Everything is going to be great. And so he really focuses in on the idea of righteous suffering. We talked about this last week. We hit on it real briefly. 3 types of suffering. There's the suffering that you get when you do something wrong. That's deserved suffering. You do something wrong, you get punished. right? Then there's the suffering called righteous suffering. And in the Bible, the righteous suffering is when you decide to follow God, when you decide to do the right thing, people cause you to suffer for that. And that's really what Peter focuses on. He barely touches on the innocent suffering. Innocent suffering would be like if you get cancer, or if you get you're born with a disability, or you have some type of other ailment that affects your body and causes you to suffer, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything other than it's a consequence of sin. But we get that. All suffering is a consequence of sin. But there's different kinds of consequences. And when you're born, you haven't had a chance to do anything wrong yet. And so maybe you're born with this, or maybe it's something that comes on later on in age as you get older. You have another ailment, or maybe just in life something happens and you're suffering. That would be the innocent suffering. Peter is really focusing on the righteous suffering. And so he begins to focus on this, and he's really just trying to help them understand what happens, the kind of suffering that comes from living right in a world gone wrong. You see, and what we will see, and what we will continue to see, is that a lot of what Peter is speaking to can really, we can almost see the wave coming here in even the United States, where we've had religious freedom, but some of those things, it's not popular to be a Christian anymore. In fact, when you go to college, and if you're a Christian, you are up against it. You're not valued the same way as anybody else. You're going to be treated differently. You're going to be thought of as less of a person. When you get into some businesses and some jobs and some careers, or you get a certain boss or management, sometimes they have a certain bent towards people that are Christians. And you might experience that kind of rejection or that kind of suffering. And so we can relate to a lot of these things. But as we get into this passage, I just read it, there's probably some things that popped out to you, and you're like, I wonder what that means. Well, that's kind of worded differently. And oftentimes when we read the Bible, we'll come across things that are like that. I kind of, as we get into this, I want to just kind of reteach us a little bit of reading etiquette. When you read something, how to take it. And what's going to happen is, as we look through this, we are automatically drawn to a couple probably different phrases. All right? We might get stuck on this thing where it says that Jesus went to the spirits in prison and proclaimed to them. We're going to talk about that, but don't get stuck on that, and don't get all wrapped up and focused on, well, man, that sounds really, we'll hit on it, and there's a lot more deeper level to it, but just understand that Peter's talking about something bigger than that. He's just using it as an illustration. He also talks about, and for many of us, this is a big thing, he talks about baptism is what saves us. Don't get caught up in the theology of it. Peter is not trying to help us understand theology. He's got a bigger picture in mind. And so whenever you read something, especially in the Bible, so many churches do this, and so many people do this, that we use a verse to apply to our lives, and we forget the surrounding verses. I can do all things through Christ, right? Every athlete ever puts that on everything they ever do if they're ever a Christian. Well, it's not a bad interpretation, it's just not a complete one. It's not talking about, I can lift 500 pounds because I can do all things. That's not what that is talking about. There's a bigger story. There's more to it when you look at the surrounding scripture. And so that's the first thing that I want to catch. But also, understand, Peter he's very particular in the way that he words things. He's not educated. And so there's a thought that somebody was helping him write some of this and put this together. But you can see Peter's thoughts as he's walking through this. In our passage, just look at this really quick. Verses 18, he starts with talking about Christ's suffering. Or your versions might say Christ died. All right? So he begins thinking in the way that he's thinking, he's noticing, he says, okay, Christ died for us. And then he kind of moves into this next part, but he's made alive in his spirit, and he starts focusing on resurrection. And then down in verse 22, he shifts and he goes in that, then he's gone to heaven, and so there's this ascension moment where Jesus goes into heaven. And then there's the last part of verse 22 where it says, angels, authorities, and powers subjected to him, and that's where he's focusing on authority. So you got to understand, Peter is got one straight thought, and he's using this little section to explain where he's going. He's trying to further explain what he has talked about before. We'll get in that in a second. The idea that Peter is trying to get across to us is what it looks like when we understand that our identity is secure in Christ. And when we surrender it to him because it is secure, we can surrender our identity to him, we can trust him with it. And so we subject ourselves, we submit not just our identity to him, but also to key relationships. People in authority over us, our spouses, people that have rule over us, that we are supposed to submit our identity even to them. And that's a very difficult thing. It's very difficult because when we do those things, we are going to feel like we're suffering. And there might be some very real moments that we really are suffering. But when we submit to authority, when we submit to our bosses, when we submit to our spouses, when we submit to the people around us, it can get very difficult. And so in today's passage, Peter is really focusing on the supreme example of submission, Jesus. So if we were just to walk into this passage without understanding that, we will get caught up in some theological debate type of things. What did it mean that Jesus went down to the spirits in prison? What does it mean that baptism is what saves us? Don't get caught up in that. Peter's got a bigger picture. Make sense? All right. So open up your Bibles, get out your apps, get out your notes. We're going to walk through the passage a little bit. Basically, what I want us to see is Peter is giving us just a simple idea. It's very simple. Here's the big idea. Our righteous suffering is our proclamation of salvation. That's what Peter is trying to get across. We're going to see that as we walk through it, that our proclamation or our suffering, our righteous suffering is a proclamation of our salvation. All right? Here we go. 1 Peter chapter 3. Follow with me. We're going to start in verse 18. The first word in there is the word for. Now, understand, again, this goes back to some reading etiquette. When the word for or the word therefore is in a passage, you want to know what it's there for, right? That word is it's a conjunction that Peter's continuing a thought, all right? He had just talked about submission. He had just talked about being subject. He's just talked about that stuff. And so he uses the word for to kind of keep that transition going. Here we go. For Christ also suffered. Some of your translations may use the word died. For Christ also suffered for the sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Now, this is the third time that Peter, in his letter, this is the third time he refers to Jesus. He's trying to keep our minds in the right place because he knows that maybe what we're going through, maybe even the suffering that we're going through, that God has a bigger plan in it, and it has something to do with Jesus. And he wants us to keep that focus. In chapter 1, he talked about Jesus being the sacrificial lamb. In chapter 2, he mentions that Christ suffered for us. And here he talks about Jesus dying and being resurrected and ascending and being an authority. See, Peter now is shifting his letter. He's shifting the focus to give hope. Each one of us probably in this room, if we're not going through a moment of suffering, we will. And he knows that we are going to have moments of suffering in our lives. And so he's not going to sugarcoat it, but he also wants us to understand that there's a bigger picture in mind. That really what Peter wants us to see is that Jesus has it all under control. And there's a bigger purpose behind it. What's that bigger purpose? Look at the verse. For Christ also suffered. Well, why did he suffer? Once for all. Okay, we'll get into that in a second. That he might bring you to God. Jesus' ultimate purpose in his suffering was to, yes, pay the consequences of our sin. But why did he pay the consequences for our sin? Because he ultimately wants us to have a relationship with God. He wants us to have this growing relationship with God. He wants us to have an intimate relationship with God. He wants us to experience what he experiences all the time. That's what we're designed for. That's what we are created for. We are created to be in a relationship with God, but sin has broken that relationship. And so Peter very purposefully puts in this little kind of like tag that he suffered once once for all. You see, you got to understand that in the culture, especially in the Old Testament, there was an economy that kind of worked its way through. That when you sinned, there was consequences. When you sinned, there had to be some type of death. And so every time you sinned, there had to be a price paid for that sin, and it was the sacrifice of lambs. It was the sacrifice of doves, whatever type of offering. In the Greek culture, there was also some of that. They would have to sacrifice certain things to the gods in order to appease them because either they had done something wrong or they just need to make sure the gods were okay. So it's all kind of built into the culture that you do this and there's a consequence. For instance, let's say you're driving down the road and you get a ticket, right? Get a speeding ticket. And a few weeks ago, actually a couple months ago, I got a ticket for speeding. You're driving down the road, you get a ticket for speeding, right? In the culture, in the Jewish culture, the way that worked is we were always sinning. You're always speeding. And so whether you got caught or not, you still had to appease God to pay for that. And so you still just paid your ticket, whether you got caught or not, which would be really tough for some of us that like to go 3 or 4 miles an hour over the speed limit because you're still speeding, so you should pay that ticket. And so in the way of their thinking, they thought, well, if I'm doing something wrong, there's a consequence. But Peter is changing the narrative of what the economy is. He says because of what Jesus did, he did it once for all. It doesn't need to be done over and over and over and over again. He doesn't need to come and sacrifice himself over and over and over again. He did it once for all. It's as if, okay, don't jump. It's as if he's saying, all of your speeding tickets in the past and in the future all paid for. That doesn't mean we can go just speeding, all right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying it's not a license to continue to sin, because if we think that way, we are minimizing the suffering of Jesus. We're taking the suffering of Jesus to be life-excusing, not life-changing. You see, what Peter is assuming that we understand is that when Jesus came and he died for us once for all, it is life-changing, not life-excusing. See, Jesus' suffering led to our salvation. That's the idea he wants to get across. Look at the next verse, verse 19. So he goes, kind of pick it up. He was put to death, made alive by the Spirit, verse 19, in which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in the past were disobedient when God patiently waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. In it, a few, that is, 8 people, were saved through water. Peter is using some very specific wording here, and we kind of get caught up in this, and in fact, if you look at a lot of commentaries, there's some contradiction as to what Peter may be saying. I don't want to get into all those details. There's a way that he's wording this, and it actually is very simple. He is using very specific terminology that would have made sense in the Greek mythology culture. He's talking about Jesus going and proclaiming what he has done to the spirits in prison. And he's talking about it in a way that it's referring to, it may, some people even believe Paul had already written his letter in Ephesians, and so that had probably circulated around a little bit, and Peter was probably referring to that, where Paul says in Ephesians 6 that we are not battling with flesh and blood, but we're battling with spiritual forces that are around us. That's what our battle is. And so some think that he may be referring to that, but on the surface, really what he's doing is he's just using some terminology that would have made sense in any culture, especially with Greek mythology. And so it says that Jesus went and made this proclamation. It's as if Jesus went to these spirits and he said, I did it. I did exactly what I said I was going to do. You're defeated. Your God is defeated. Satan is defeated. Sin is defeated. I told you what we were going to do. It's done, and you no longer have power over people. It's a really cool thought. But then Peter also equates this idea of Noah. Did you notice that he kind of puts Noah into the equation? And this part is really neat, that he starts talking about that in the days of Noah there was an ark and 8 people were saved, and so people would have understood the story. But see, whenever there's a story in the Bible, whenever there's something that happens in the Bible, they think a bigger picture. They are looking for depth in it. The way that they word things, the way they talk about things is very different than the way that we think. And so what Peter is doing, this is really cool. He's really connecting the dots, again, the big story, Jesus' death, resurrection, ascension, and authority. He is connecting those dots with Noah. Think about this. Noah had to trust that his identity was secure in God. He had to surrender his identity to God. He had to submit to God, who was his authority at the time. And he had to trust him. And so he had to even convince his family and talk to his family, and they had to submit in a way that they went into the ark for salvation. Peter is making a connection between us being in Christ and being saved, and Noah going into the ark and being saved. He's putting these things together. They found their security from judgment. They had to surrender their feelings and fears and enter the ark, and they end up living in the ark. Listen, they lived in the ark for over 370 days. Do you think there was a little bit of suffering going on with Noah and his family? And the crazy, stinky animals and everything else? He's in there for over a year. If you've ever been with your family, and they're all grown up and they all have, spouses, and you all get on a boat, I don't care how big it is. For a year, it's going to drive you crazy. And I'm sure there are moments when his family's like, how much longer are we going to be in this thing? See, what he's doing, this is brilliant what Peter's doing. He is connecting Jesus' suffering with Noah's suffering, that Noah's suffering led to our salvation also. And we may miss that when we get caught up in some of the weeds of things. But really what he's trying to help us do is see there's a big break. So look at verse 21. Then he talks about baptism. Watch this. Now again, watch the language. Here we go. Baptism, which corresponds to this, corresponds to what? To what he was talking about Noah and what he was talking about Jesus. Okay? Baptism, now which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal from dirt from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience towards God through the resurrection of Jesus, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels and authorities and powers subject to him. He makes this statement that baptism now saves you. And you got to understand, in the Jewish culture, baptism was a very common thing. In fact, Paul gets in somewhat of a debate with people in Acts chapter 19, where he's talking about where people are saying, I was baptized by Peter, I was baptized by John, I was baptized, and there was like this debate about, well, who should we be baptized in? Because in the culture, when you got baptized with somebody, when you went to John the Baptist to get baptized, when you went to one of the disciples to get baptized, you were following that rabbi, you were following that teacher, you were subjecting yourself to that person. And what Peter is assuming the people understand, and assuming that we understand, is that they were being baptized into Christ. And being in Christ is what saves us. The act of baptism has always been all throughout the Bible. It was always a proclamation of who you were subjecting authority to. It was who you were putting yourself under the authority of. And when Jesus came along and he was baptized, he didn't need to be baptized from sin. He didn't sin. When he was baptized, he was subjecting himself to God. It was a public proclamation of, I am subject to God. And so this is where Peter is running with this. It wasn't for removal of dirt. That is kind of like, he's kind of getting into a little bit more terminology that we probably don't catch on to, but back then also there was this idea when you're baptized, you had kind of all the dirt that was on you was kind of like sin. And so he's like, it's not removing the dirt, it's not removing the sin. Baptism isn't doing that. It's making yourself subject to something bigger. It's saying that you are in Christ. He's not minimizing water baptism at all. The word baptism means to be immersed in, to be under. That's why we make baptism such a big deal here, and the way that we do it, because we think it's a big deal to be a proclamation of Jesus being, and you being in Jesus and Jesus being in you. So what he's really saying is this, that maybe, just maybe, our suffering may lead to others' salvation. Because there's so many people that were baptized And it led to other people's salvation because they saw this proclamation from the individual that God is their God, that they were putting themselves under authority, and it led to many people. That's where he references that as Noah went into the ark, even the 8 people, as few as 8, were saved, because Noah had subjected himself to God, and his family followed, they were all saved. And then he ends with this last little statement, that he ascends and he's with the angels and authorities and powers subject to him. This is just basically a straightforward statement that Jesus is all-powerful and everything that happens is under his control. All right, I hope that all makes sense. Because this is where I want to head with this, and this is what I was kind of processing. When we look at a passage like this, we can get wrapped up in it, but really Peter is continuing this conversation about suffering. And while many of us in this room may not be suffering for doing something righteous, just about all of us can understand what it means to suffer. And I came across this quote in a book by Paul David Tripp on suffering. And I just thought the way he worded this was perfect. Look at this. It is wonderful and life-changing to know that we are not controlled, nor is our life determined by what we suffer, but by the one who rules all the situations, locations, and relationships where that suffering takes place. Listen to this. Salvation isn't found in our ability to escape suffering, but in the presence and the grace of the one who meets us in it. When we go through suffering, it's an opportunity for Jesus to meet us in the middle of that and to help us get through it. If you're suffering, it doesn't mean you're not saved. In fact, it probably means the opposite. It means that you probably are saved, and Jesus is meeting you where he needs to meet you. And he's got it under control, especially if you're suffering for doing the right thing. All right? Our righteous suffering is our proclamation of salvation. When we suffer, not only we will feel like we're disconnected from God, we will have these emotions that we feel like we're losing control. That's really the problem with suffering, is that we don't have control. If you look more in Paul David Tripp's book, he really gets into that, and it really starts to make sense. It gives us a better picture of what suffering really is about. And Peter wants us to understand that we should fear God. And when we fear God, the equation is not you compared to the size of who God is or the size of your trial, but how big God is. And however deep our suffering is, it's an opportunity for God to show us how much bigger he is than that. And it may be that the suffering we're going through, we may not see an end. We may feel like it's day 10 of 370 days in the ark. And the reality is, maybe even our suffering is an opportunity for somebody else to see God working in us. So let me give you 3 really fast, 3 perspective-changing habits to practice before, during, and after times of suffering. Any type of suffering, even the type of suffering that comes from you doing something wrong and having to pay the consequences of, these 3 habits are incredibly valuable to help you work through, to help you understand, to help give you a different perspective of your suffering. All right? And these are really simple. The first one is be honest with God and your suffering. Psalm chapter 6, the Psalm of David says this, "Be gracious to me, Lord, for I am weak." If you've ever dealt with any kind of suffering, you can hear it in David's voice when he says this. "Heal me, Lord, for my bones are shaking. My whole being is shaken with terror. And you, Lord, how long? Turn, Lord, rescue me. Save me because of your faithful love. For there is no remembrance of you in death. Who can thank you in Sheol? I am weary and I'm groaning. With my tears I dampen my bed and drench my couch every night. My eyes are swollen from grief. I grow old because of my enemies." David is struggling. And he's being honest with what he's feeling. He's being honest with God about what he's feeling and going through. Many years ago, about 17 years ago or so, we were in a church. And things were going great. The youth group had exploded from 20 to about 200. The church was declining. It had gone from 300 to about 100 people. People were leaving the church for different reasons. And the leadership, and I was a pastor there, but the deacons, they had a deacon. They didn't have elders, they just had deacons, and deacons ran the church. And so we were in a couple meetings, and I started bringing up, I would talk with my pastor. He was kind of my boss at the time, and I would talk to him about the different things that might be contributing to the decline. And we started talking about some pretty heavy things. There are some things going on with the worship team where 3 of them were having an affair. 2 of them were drug addicts and selling drugs. There was so many things going on. There was a person in the leadership that was manipulating the truth about things and spying on different ministries, especially when it came to youth ministry, and twisting the truth about things in a way because he just wanted a little bit more control. And there was another person in the leadership that was running the school at the time, and he was taking information and twisting it and distorting it because he was trying to do things that weren't quite right. And I started taking a stand up against some of those things. And it became a very difficult time. And I remember for 2 months just going, God, this is awful. Free me from this. Will you just fix this? Will you just take it? Why am I having to go through this? Why are we going through this? Why can't people just get it right? And my heart just ached. And then I watched, and I noticed that it was affecting my wife. And she was getting frustrated with the church, and she felt alone and abandoned at the church, where nobody was talking to her about anything, and it seemed like everyone was starting to turn against us, and we were doing everything on our own, and we're living in Southern California, making less than $30,000 a year with 4 kids. And this is the early 2000s, and I just remember just praying, God, what is going on? We've been abandoned by the people that are closest to us. They've turned on us, and they're saying stuff that isn't true. We're supposed to trust the leadership, but they won't do anything about what's happening. It was a very difficult moment, very dark. And I had several different people that I had been talking to that were outside of the church that were kind of mentors for me. One of them was my dad, but I had some other pastoral friends that I would just kind of speak to and just say, hey, what do you think? And time again, they said, you got to go. You're not going to be able to change anything. You got to leave. And every part of my heart was like, no, I can do this. I can do all things through Christ. Is that good to lose your family over that? No. Is it good to lose your faith in who God is in the middle of that? Probably not. And all that stuff started kind of wearing away. It took me about a month after having some of those conversations to realize it was time to go. And it was a hard decision because we felt like we were leaving a group of kids that didn't have adults who cared about them, and they finally had adults that cared about them, and they were starting to grow in their faith, and they were starting to understand Jesus, and now we were going to leave them. But I'll tell you, God took us through that moment of suffering so that we could go to another place and grow and be loved on and cared for better than ever. And it changed our perspective. And as I look back, some of the kids that went through that and they were so hurt that we were leaving, they've grown closer to Christ. Not all of them, but they grew closer to Christ because they knew they were relying on Lori and I to be their Savior, and they needed to rely on Jesus. And so they went through a time of suffering where they felt abandoned, and yet they had to depend on Christ. You see, sometimes our suffering is a bigger benefit. So that leads us to our second one. Be mindful of God's character and faithfulness. The second practice that we can put into place is to be mindful of God's character and faithfulness. Look at this. Psalm 63, again, David. God, you are my God. I earnestly seek you. I thirst for you. My body faints for you in a land that is dry, desolate, and without water. That sounds like some suffering. So I gaze on you in the sanctuary to see your strength and your glory. My lips will glorify you because of your faithful love. It's better than life. So I will bless you as long as I live. At your name I will lift my hands. You will satisfy me with rich food. My mouth will praise you with joyful lips. You see, God has promised us that he will be faithful. And what you are going through has a greater purpose. Listen to this. What you may be going through in your suffering has a greater purpose than your comfort. And that's the hardest thing to understand. And sometimes in the middle of your discomfort, you just need to go back and say, God, I remember your faithfulness. I'm going to reflect. I'm going to keep that in my mind. See, David, he is going through a dry moment in his life. He is suffering, but he's remembering what God has done for him in the past. So be reminded of God's character and his faithfulness. God will always care for his own. And finally, the last one. Be encouraged by God's grace and mercy. First one, be honest with God about your suffering. Be reminded of God's character and his faithfulness. And third, be encouraged by God's grace and mercy. Look at this, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Concerning this, and this is Paul talking, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. He's talking about this suffering that he's going through, and he's struggling, and he just wants God to remove it. He's got a thorn in the flesh, something that is causing him to suffer. We don't know what it is. And this is what God said. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. And Paul, therefore I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. He had flipped the perspective of his suffering, where he was gracious. He was grateful for his suffering because it allowed him to see his weaknesses so that he had to rely on Jesus. You see, we might be going through some suffering. And we just want God's grace. And grace, really simply, grace is being given something that you don't deserve. Mercy is not being given something that you do deserve. God's mercy is on us that we deserve death, but he shows us his mercy. And he doesn't give us death, at least in the spiritual side of things. But God's grace in the middle of suffering, sometimes the suffering we go through is not because we've done anything wrong. It's not because we have messed up. It's simply because God is trying to do something bigger. He's trying to help us understand what salvation looks like. He's trying to help us and the people around us see him. And it might be that he is taking us through one of the most discomforting, difficult moments. And see, what we're going to see now from here on out is Peter starts to give this hope that there's a bigger picture that Jesus is putting in store for us. And as he gets into chapter 4 and he gets into chapter 5, he starts to let us see how the church can come alongside of us in the midst of suffering, how the church can be this place where we can suffer together. It's just better to suffer together with people that you know is suffering with you. There's something about that. And how we can come alongside of each other to help each other through those moments, because they're going to come. As we close this morning, as the band comes up, I think their song, Mighty to Save, made a lot of sense. Because God is mighty to save. But we are probably, at some point in our lives, going to go through some type of suffering. We are probably at some moment, if we're not right now, we are going to have one of these moments where we question whether God really loves us. We might even start questioning, did I do something wrong? Did I mess up? Did I say the wrong thing? Why is God treating me this way? We might have all those kind of questions coming up. But when we start to put into practice the things that we just talked about recognizing God's faithfulness and his character, remembering that, being honest with him about what we're going through, and continue to focus on what he's promised us, and that he's given us grace and mercy in many times in ways that we never noticed. When we begin to focus on that stuff, things change, and maybe our perspective changes a little bit. And so as we sing this last song together, we may feel like we cannot say, bless you, God. Our soul may be really struggling with saying, bless God. Thank you. I know who you are. I get it. I don't know why I'm going through what I'm going through. This is awful. But no matter how many reasons I come up with that pushes back, no matter how many things I'm feeling that pushes back on how great you are, I am going to bless you. And so this morning as we sing together, if you need prayer, if you need one of us to pray for you, we have elders around the room, we will pray with you. But maybe you haven't gotten to that point yet where you have said, all right, I'm gonna, God, I'm all in. I'm going to subject myself to your authority. And maybe the suffering that I've been going through has taken me to this place right now where I realize I need you to come into my life. I need to be in you, and I need you in me so I can grow in my relationship with you, so I can understand why I'm going through what I'm going through. And if you haven't started that journey yet, we will also pray with you and be able to share Christ with you. But as we sing together, make this a proclamation from your soul. I bless you, God. Let's stand and sing together.
And bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship his holy name. We'll sing like never before, oh my soul, worship your holy name.
The sun comes up, it's a new day dawn. It's time to sing your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. You're rich in love and you're slow to anger. Your name is great and your heart is kind. For all your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. Bless the